Hello, welcome to UGCE PG Pathshala. Myself, Professor Mary Tahir, Department of Geography, Jamia Millia Islamia, will speak on behavioral geography, which is part of the paper Geographical Thought. This has been written by my dear colleague Dr. Tharuna Bansal, Assistant Professor, Department of Geography, Jamia Millia Islamia. In this module, the following are the learning objectives. Number 1, to understand the reasons for the growth of behavioralism in geography, to discuss the objectives of this approach in geography. Number 3, to analyze the salient features of behavioral geography. Next, to explore why this doctrine has been criticized. Now, we will go on to the introduction. I will introduce this. By the mid-1960s, the use of statistical techniques in research for precision has been largely accepted by geographers. The duality of systematic versus regional geography was resolved as both were now accepted as important components of the discipline, though interdependent and equally very much useful. It was increasingly realized by the geographers that the models propounded and tested with the help of quantitative techniques provided poor descriptions of geographic reality as well as the man-environment relationship. Consequently, the progress towards the development of geographical theory was glaringly or rather very slow, and its predictive powers were very weak. Theories such as central place theory based on statistical and mathematical techniques were found inadequate to explain the spatial organization of the society. The economic rationality of decision making was also criticized, as it does not explain the behavior of man. It was a psychological twist in human geography which emphasized the role of subjective and decision making processes that mediate the association between environment and spatial behavior of man. It can be said that the dissatisfaction with the models and theories developed by the positivists using the statistical techniques which were based on the economic rationality of man led to the development of behavioral approach in geography. The axiom of economic person who always tries to maximize his profit was challenged by Wolpert in his paper entitled "The Decision Process in Spatial Context." According to him, he compared the actual and potential labor productivity of Swedish farmers and came to the conclusion that optimal farming practices were not possible. He concluded that the farmers were not optimizing and were not satisfied. Thus, human behavior was seen to be a product of decision making, and it was a human tendency to have incomplete information, to make imperfect choices and even then be satisfied with suboptimal options. Now, we go on to the next section, that is behavioralism in geography. Behavioral geography banks heavily on behavioralism, or rather how behavior is. Behavioralism is an important approach which is largely inductive, aiming to build general statements out of observations of ongoing processes. The essence of behavioral approach in geography lies in the fact that the way in which people behave is mediated by the understanding of the environment in which they live or by the environment itself with which they are daily confronted. In behavioral geography, an explanation for man-environment problem is founded upon the premise that environmental recognition and behavior are intimately related. In other words, behavioral approach has taken the view that a deeper understanding of man-environment interaction can be achieved by looking at the various psychological processes through which man comes to know the environment in which he lives, and by examining the way in which these processes influence the nature of the resultant behavior. One of the most interesting and applied aspects of behavioral geography was the work which examined the human perception of environmental hazards. The pioneering work by Robert Cates in 1962 on floodplain management is on the basis of this approach. According to him, the manner in which human beings perceive the uncertainty and the unpredictability of the environment play a very important role in the process of decision making. he developed a scheme that had relevance to a wide range of human behavior. This scheme of Kate's was based on 4 major assumptions. Men are rational while taking decisions, number 1. Number 2, men make choices. Number 3, choices are made on the basis of knowledge. And number 4, information is evaluated to predetermined criteria. Subsequently, Kirk supplied one of the first behavioral models. In his model, he asserted that in space and time, the same information would have different meanings for people of different socioeconomic, cultural and ethnic backgrounds living in a similar geographical environment. Each individual of a society reacts differently to a piece of information about the resource, space and environment. This point may be further explained by citing the following example. The highly productive Indo-Gangetic plains have different meanings for different individuals belonging to different caste, creed and religion. Therefore, Jats, Gujars, Ahirs, Sainis, Jojas and Gadas living in the same village perceive the environment differently. A Jat farmer may like to sow sugarcane in his field. A Gada and a Joja may devote his land to sugarcane, wheat and rice, whereas an Ahir may like to grow fodder crops for the milch animals, and a Saini is invariably interested in intensive cultivation, especially that of vegetables. For the vegetable grower, even 5 acres of arable land may be a large holding, while for a Jat, he has to use a tractor when he is taking care of 25 acres, and for him it is a small holding. The perceived environment of each of these farmers living in the same environment thus differs from each other in space and time. The aspect which was most enthusiastically adopted by geographers from behavioral analysis was the concept of mental maps. The paper of Peter was the first which contributed in this regard. He points out that since decisions on location were guided by the manner in which a human being perceives the environment, it becomes essential for a geographer to have a mental image of how one perceives his environment while making decisions. Therefore, mental maps are not just images or maps, but an amalgamation of information and interpretation that a person has on one particular thing, as well as how or she perceives that place. This was further developed by various scholars who through their various writings. According to him, mental maps are not only means of examining a person's area of spatial preference, but also provides insight into the processes which led to that particular decision. He states that mental maps may provide a key to some of the structures, patterns and processes of man's work on the earth's surface. And the conceptual framework which has been provided by Downes has been well illustrated in figure 1, if you could look into that. This framework proposes that information from environment, that is the real world, is filtered as a result of personality, culture, beliefs and cognitive variables to form image in the mind of man who utilizes his environment. On the basis of the image formed in the mind of the utilizer about the environment, he takes the decision and uses the resources to fulfill his basic and higher needs. Downes, in his framework, suggested that there exists a relationship between the objective and a behavioral environment. According to Praed, who presented an alternative to this inductive approach of behavioralists on the theory building on economic man in his work Behavior and Location, in which he proposes a behavioral matrix which has been given in figure 2, which explains the structure in which the decisions of locations can be analyzed. The axes of the matrix are quality and quantity of information available and the availability to use that information, particular information, as the economic being is at the right hand corner. As there is variation in the quantity and quality of the information, the position of man on the axis would also change. His position would reflect his aspiration levels, experience and even norms of the group to which he may belong. He further states that even the same individual would not be in the same position, as his decisions may vary over time, as spatial patterns are never static in nature. During the 1970s, a range of related personality assessments such as personal construct theory and the semantic differential were employed, and in this work geography and psychology have become very much closely associated, rather neighbors, which has been stated by various scholars. In particular, this productive interdisciplinary relationship was developed through the annual meetings of the Environmental Design Research Association, and in the pages it has been given in the pages of the new journal, that is Environment and Behavior. Since that period, behavioral geography has continued to diversify. Even its position has been less elevated than in the 60s and 1970s, when many disciplinary leaders worked in this subdiscipline. More recent research has induced analysis of environmental learning, spatial search, developmental issues in spatial cognition and cartography. And Gollitz's important work with the disabled and sight impaired has illustrated the point. But some of the luster has left the field. In this part, this can be due to the methodological sensibilities of positivist human geography. In part, it is due to the growing conviction of the inherently socialized nature of geographical knowledge, which challenges the individualism of psychological models. In this part, it has been clearly shown that a suspicion of the adequacy of an epistemology of observation and measurement that may leave unexamined, non-observable and non-measurable contexts and ideological formations. Nonetheless, behavioral geography has a continuing legacy, comprehensively itemized and integrated in the massive compilation has been explained by Gollitz and Stimson in 1997. Next, the objectives of behavioral approach are the following: to develop models for human phenomena which would provide an alternative to the spatial location theories which has developed under the influence of positivism, to define the cognitive environment that determines the decision making process of humans. Next, to come up with the psychological and social theories of human decision making and behavior in a spatial framework. Next, to change the emphasis from aggregate populations to the disaggregate scale of individuals and as well as small group. To search for methods other than those popular during the quantitative revolution that could uncover the latent structure in data and decision making. Next, to emphasize on precision rather than structural explanations of human activity and physical environment, to generate primary data about human behavior and not to rely too much heavily on the published data, and also to adopt an interdisciplinary approach for theory building as well as problem solving. The fundamental arguments of the behavioral geography to achieve these objectives are as follows: people already have environmental images. Those images can be identified accurately by researchers, and there is definitely a strong relationship between environmental image and actual behavior or the decision making process of man. The behavioral paradigm has been shown in figure 3, and one can look into that. In this paradigm, it has been shown that man has been depicted as a thinking individual whose transactions with the environment are mediated by mental processes and cognitive representation of external environment. In geographical circles, this concept is derived primarily from the work of Boulding, who suggested that over time individuals' developmental impressions of the world are formed through the everyday contacts with the environment, and these images act as the basis of their behavior. Next, we go on to the next section that deals with the salient features of behavioral geography. The salient features of behavioral geography are as follows. The behavioral geographers argued that environmental cognition, or rather perception, upon which people act may well differ very much from the nature or the real environment of the real world. Space, the spatial environment thus can be said to have a dual character, such as an objective environment, the world of actuality, which may be gauged by some direct means, that is the senses, or as a behavioral environment, the world of the mind, which can be studied only by indirect means. No matter how partial or selective the behavioral environment may be, it is this milieu which is the basis of decision making and action of man. By behavioral environment, it is meant reality as it is perceived by individuals. In other words, people make choices and the choices are made on the basis of their own knowledge. Thus, the view of behavior was rooted in the world as perceived rather than in the world of actuality. The nature of difference between these two environments and their implications for behavior has been given by Kafka in his work in 35-36 in the last century, in an allusion to a medieval social Swiss tale about a winter travel. Secondly, behavioral geographers give more weight to an individual rather than to groups or organizations or to the society. In other words, the focus of study is the individual, not the group or community. They assert that research must recognize the fact that the individual shapes and responds to his physical and social environment. In fact, it is necessary to recognize that the actions of each and every person has a deep impact on the environment, however slight or inadvertent that impact may be. Man is goal-directed animal who influences the environment and in turn gets influenced by it. In brief, an individual rather than a group of people or social group is more important in man-nature relationship. Behavioral approach in geography postulated a mutually interacting relationship between man and his environment, whereby man shaped the environment and was subsequently shaped by it. The fourth important feature of behavioral geography is multidisciplinary outlook. A behavioral geographer takes the help of ideas, paradigms and theories produced by psychologists, philosophers, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, ethnologists and planners. However, the lack of theories of its own is coming in the way of rapid development of behavioral geography. Therefore, one can say that the behavioral approach in geography is a fruitful one and it helps in establishing a scientific relationship between man and his environment. The broad scope of behavioral geography is remarkable even by the standards of human geography. Now, there are various criticisms regarding this approach. These are, however, overall biases in context towards urban topics and towards developed countries. One of the main weaknesses of behavioral geography is that it lacks in synthesis of empirical findings, poor communication, inadvertent duplication and conflicting terminology. In behavioral geography, the terminology and concepts remain loosely defined and poorly integrated primarily owing to the lack of systematically organized theoretical basis. Another shortcoming of behavioral geography lies in the fact that most of its data are generated in laboratory experiments on animals and the findings are applied directly to human behavior. Koestler pointed to the danger of this strategy in that behavioralism has replaced the anthropomorphic fallacy ascribing to animals human faculties and sentiments with the opposite fallacy denying man faculties not found in lower animals. It has substituted for the erstwhile anthropomorphic view of a rat, a ratomorphic view of man. In short, behavioralistic theories are elegant but unhelpful when it comes to understanding the real world where man and an environment interacts. Behavioral geography has too often put too much emphasis on ego-centered interpretations of the environment. Specifically, scholars are critical of two assumptions on which a great deal of behavioral research in geography is based. The first assumption is that there exist identifiable environmental images that can be accurately measured. it is not clear whether an environmental image can be extracted without distortion from the totality of mental imagery. Moreover, not enough effort has gone into checking and validating the methods by which images are elicited. The second critical assumption is that there exists a strong relationship between the revealed images or references and the actual or the real world behavior. The main objection to this assumption is that it is unfounded assumption because extremely little literature has been taken under this to examine the congruence between image and behavior. Another significant deficiency in behavioral geography has been the gap between theory and practice. This has been noticeable over the question of public policy. In fact, behavioral geographers remain observers rather than participants. There is a serious lack of knowledge of planning theories and methods among behavioral geographers, which is an impediment to more active involvement. It is a barrier that can be removed only by developing the requisite understanding of the planning processes. It cannot be camouflaged by noble sentiments and moral tone. For instance, it will only rarely that a small survey carried out upon a sample of students will supply the basis for far-reaching policy recommendations. Yet, the final paragraphs of many such works contain the seemingly obligatory element. Despite several constraints and methodological limitations, behavioral geography is now widely accepted within the positivist orientation. It seeks to account for spatial patterns by establishing generalizations about the relationship between people and environment, interrelationship which may then be used to stimulate change through environmental planning activities that modify the stimuli which affect the spatial behavior of ourselves and others. The research methods of behavioral geography vary substantially, but the general orientation is inductive generalization leading to planning for environmental change remains. Eventually, it is hoped a powerful new theory will emerge. Lastly, Golledge argued that substantial advances in understanding spatial behavior have already been made by studying the individual preferences, opinions, attitudes, cognitions, cognitive maps, perception and so on and on, what he terms as processes and variables. Thank you.